By the early 2010s, the 7th generation of consoles had wiped out most of the survival horror genre. With a higher demand for cinematic thrillers and action shooters, even franchises like Resident Evil tried to adapt to the trend. And as we all know, the games were a little shitty. PT could have been one of the greatest survival horror games ever made, but yeah, thanks Konami. But in 2025, survival horror is thriving again. Resident Evil is respected, Silent Hill is back, and studios are no longer afraid to go all in. And in my opinion, this comeback can be traced back to one game in particular, Resident Evil 7. You can't say for sure that this one game single-handedly brought the genre back, but I feel there is a strong argument to be made that it was the one to do so. So let's look at how Resident Evil 7 saved survival horror. The year is 2013 and Resident Evil 6 was still relatively fresh in the market, mostly being criticized for trying to be a Call of Duty wannabe with their over-the-top cinematic moments and loss of meaningful horror. This was kind of a last straw for fans. Yes, the game sold well, but you know you can't keep this up for long, do you? So Resident Evil is not doing well. Dead Space is in my opinion a very tragic case because of how promising it was. The first two games are absolutely amazing. While yes, clearly inspired by the likes of Resident Evil, a survival horror game in space was simply too fresh and cool to pass on. But of course, EA being EA, they had to f it up with the third one, so Dead Space is also out. Silent Hill must have had the biggest downfall by 2013. This started much sooner with Konami sticking it to Team Silent after Silent Hill 4, but after Homecoming and other disappointments, Downpour released in 2012 was the last nail in the coffin. Ironically, Silent Hill was officially lost in the fog. It felt like every big franchise either passed away in a sense or abandoned the genre which made them popular. Now, AAA survival horror games were all about shooters and cinematic drama. If you wanted horror, you had to go indie. But there is one game that could have changed the tide. PT, standing for Playable Teaser, came out in 2014 on the PlayStation Store as a demo for Silent Hills. It had no announcement, no advertisement, nothing. Just simply dropped. And its impact cannot be undermined. In my personal experience, PT is a phenom. I know people who've never heard of Silent Hill before the remake, but they sure as shit knew about PT for being the most terrifying piece of media ever created. One demo, one hallway, and somehow it hit harder than entire franchises. It was fresh and it was cryptic and it was terrifying. It felt like not only Silent Hill was making a comeback, but also survival horror. But then, shit hit the fan. Konami being Konami decided to stick the finger to Hideo Kojima as well, and they had a falling out. PT was pulled from the PlayStation Store and cancelled completely. So after this whole situation with Konami and Hideo Kojima, Silent Hill went silent. But in the middle of all of that noise, Capcom was quietly building something. Something risky, something strange, and something that would completely flip the script. When Resident Evil 6 hit the shelves in 2012, Capcom was making a bunch of money off of it. But the reception told a much different story. Despite all the sales, the game had many worrying flaws and the franchise was at a crossroads. Internally, there was even talks of continuing this trend with the so-called Resident Evil 6.5, a version of Resident Evil 7 in early development that still leaned really f***ing hard towards what 5 and 6 did prior. In fact, in this original version, Ethan and Mia, which we know as husband and wife, were originally complete strangers. Ethan was an investigator looking for a missing woman, which was Mia. Things changed when Capcom CEO Kenzo Tsushimoto realized that the franchise is in trouble. So he brought in Yun Takeuchi, who previously worked on Resident Evil 1 and 5, to take over and fix Resident Evil. His vision was clear. Resident Evil 7 had to be a survival horror game once more. One of the boldest decisions was to shift the game to a first-person perspective. This was a risky move, but it promised a deeper immersion, putting the player right in the shoes of the protagonist. Takeuchi assembled a small dedicated team of about 10 people to kickstart development. They had a lot of freedom. Pretty much anyone who had an idea for the game, which also didn't need to be bound to the franchise, could speak their mind and pitch the idea. This freedom helped the team rapidly prototype and discard ideas, pushing the game towards something that felt right instead of what was expected. At the same time, Takeuchi understood that the tools used to build the game needed to be just as innovative as his vision. The old engine Capcom was using was not good enough anymore for what they were trying to do, so development began on a new engine called the RE engine, short for Reach for the Moon. The engine was tailor-made for this game, designed to create highly realistic visuals while also streamlining production to save money and time. Photogrammetry was a technology that transformed the game's look and feel. Instead of creating from scratch real textures and props and environments, with this technology they could process the real-world stuff and scan them into the game as ultra-realistic 3D models. The team also took a research trip to Louisiana to study the look for the game. The southern gothic atmosphere was the inspiration for the game with its rundown look. They also implemented VR due to one of the developers' passion for it, and the VR kitchen was made. It's crazy how they managed in such a short span of time to make so much stuff. Now this is not to say that they didn't face challenges. They did many times. The biggest one was the second part of the game, which had bad pacing and wasn't able to scare the player as good as the first half, so they had to redo it all over again. When Resident Evil 7 was finally revealed at E3 2016, the fans went nuts. This reveal came with a release date of January 24th, 2017, which meant that the game successfully avoided delays. They did release a demo for the game back in 2016 consisting of the earliest part of the game, and it looked amazing, yet not like a Resident Evil game. Very little gameplay to be played, there wasn't even any combat. This was a clear shot at recreating the magic of the Silent Hills demo PT. Nonetheless, Resident Evil 7 did not disappoint. The game is a masterpiece in creating dreadful horror, combining it with tight, barely illuminated and monster-filled environments. Despite having so many guns to choose from, the game actually instills this sense of terror in the player from its encounters, compared to Resident Evil 5 and 6, which became way less focused on doing that. In this game, resource management actually was stressful. Every bullet mattered and every health item mattered, and that constant tension returns in full force. And that's why making the protagonist someone like Ethan, a normal guy with no real combat training, was a genius move. You're not Leon Kennedy, you're not Chris Redfield. You're just a guy trying to survive. Resident Evil 7 not only saved Resident Evil, but in my opinion, it would go on to do so much more than that. Resident Evil 7 went on to sell 14.7 million copies as of March 2025. And we all know how loved the game is. Just to make a better case for my claim, let's talk about numbers for the Resident Evil franchise and others. And of course I need to mention that these are just estimates. Obviously Resident Evil never quite fell off. Yeah, it did get bad and most likely would have gone towards the path of falling off, but the fall off never happened. With this huge success of Resident Evil 7, the remake of 2 has 15.4 million, the remake of 3, despite being mediocre, still sits at almost 10 million, Resident Evil 8 sits at 11.3, and the remake of 4 already is at almost 10 million. But Resident Evil is the big dog of the survival horror genre, so of course they're gonna sell the most. The Silent Hill 2 remake sold 1 million in 3 days, and over 2 million by January 2025. Which is like the first 3 months. As late of April of this year, the whole genre has sold 11.5, but before the remake it was at 9. This likely means that by the time of this video's release, it sure as shit hit 3 million. Now, these numbers might not seem like much, but when considering that the franchise was dead for over a decade, it makes them look amazing. We haven't gotten a proper game since 2012, and even that one was shit. All those mobile games, or small, whatever they were, don't count. Same goes for PT. Dead Space remake from 2023 sold a respectable 2 million, which again, for fuck's sake EA, you killed Dead Space with the third one back in 2013. How the hell were you expecting 5 million? Unfortunately, this pretty much means the end for Dead Space, which is a shame, because those numbers show that the franchise still has a fan base. While the first Alan Wake was more of an action horror game, Alan Wake 2 is more of a survival horror game. It did take a lot for it to turn a profit, but at the end of 2024, the game has sold over 2 million copies. And all of these games have been received great by critics and fans because they show that survival horror is a genre worth investing time and money into. And I know some people might see even the Resident Evil numbers as low because hey, we live in a world where Rockstar Games literally sold over 200 million with GTA 5 and 75 million with Red Dead Redemption 2 alone. I know they look like pennies on the dollar, but it's extremely unfair to compare survival horror games to the likes of these. I think these sales tell a good story. Survival horror has a fan base even now in 2025 that demands more of it. With more AAA games coming our way, like the remake of Silent Hill, the brand new Silent Hill F, and the colossal Resident Evil 9 only being 6 months away, survival horror is back. And in my eyes, it can all be traced back to one game. One game that not only saved a franchise, but an entire genre. Thank you for watching my video. I was Sweet, and I'll see you next time.